Do you ever think about those things you could do on a plane in the 1970s that would get you arrested today? Flying back then meant freedom so casual that stepping onto an aircraft felt more like entering a private lounge than a regulated transit system. So what changed so drastically that the skies we once trusted became the most controlled space on Earth? Smoking cigarettes in any seat throughout the entire flight was as normal as fastening your seatbelt, and nobody batted an eye when the cabin filled with a soft gray haze drifting between rows like a slow-moving cloud. In the 1970s, ashtrays were built into every armrest, tucked beside tray tables, waiting patiently for passengers to light up before takeoff even finished. Flight attendants offered matches alongside drinks, and the smell of tobacco mixed with recycled air became the signature scent of air travel itself. People smoked during meals, during movies, and during conversations with strangers seated inches away. Children sat beside exhaled smoke without anyone questioning whether it might be harmful. The smoke curled upward toward overhead vents that barely moved it, settling instead into hair, clothes, and upholstery. Flight crews accepted it as part of the job, never imagining a future where lighting a cigarette mid-flight would become a federal offense. Today, the idea of someone pulling out a lighter at 30,000 feet feels absolutely unthinkable. Yet for decades, it was simply what people did. Walking into the cockpit to visit the pilots mid-flight was one of those magical experiences children talked about for years afterward, clutching plastic wings pinned to their shirts like badges of honor. In the 1970s, cockpit doors stayed unlocked and sometimes wide open, inviting curious passengers to peek inside at glowing instruments and switches. Parents encouraged their kids to walk up and say hello, and pilots welcomed the company, showing off altitude gauges and explaining what each dial controlled. Some children even sat in the jump seat, watching clouds part below while the captain pointed out landmarks. It was an era when trust between passengers and crew felt natural, when the idea of someone dangerous boarding a plane seemed far-fetched. Flight attendants smiled as families lined up for photos beside uniformed pilots who seemed genuinely happy to share their workspace. Today, that same door is reinforced with steel, locked from the inside, and protected by federal law. The friendly visits that once made flying feel personal have been replaced by barriers designed to keep everyone firmly in their place. Bringing full-size bottles of liquor through security checkpoints was something travelers did without a second thought in the 1970s, tucking fifths of whiskey into carry-on bags like any other travel essential. Nobody questioned a bottle clinking against toiletries, and security lines moved quickly because inspections were brief and casual. Passengers planned to enjoy drinks mid-flight, share a toast with seatmates, or save money by avoiding the airline's limited bar menu. Duty-free shops sold oversized bottles specifically designed for travelers, and people carried them openly through terminals without raising a single eyebrow. The idea that liquid could pose a threat never crossed anyone's mind. Security focused on metal detectors and quick bag glances rather than scanning every item. Families packed bottles as gifts for relatives waiting at their destination. Today, any liquid over 3.4 ounces triggers immediate confiscation. The rules arrived suddenly after security concerns reshaped every aspect of air travel. Full-size bottles now belong in checked luggage, and the casual days of carrying whatever you pleased have vanished into strict regulations. Carrying knives and sharp objects in carry-on bags was completely unremarkable in the 1970s, when pocket knives were considered practical tools rather than potential threats. Business travelers kept small blades tucked beside pens and notepads, using them to open packages or cut loose threads. Families packed Swiss Army knives for camping trips, tossing them into bags without worrying whether security might object. The idea that someone could weaponize an everyday tool felt distant and almost paranoid. Inspectors glanced at bags quickly, waving travelers through with minimal fuss because the focus was keeping lines moving rather than examining every item. Nail clippers, scissors, and letter openers passed through checkpoints alongside the knives without anyone blinking. People carried what they needed, trusting that fellow passengers posed no danger. The atmosphere felt relaxed, almost neighborly. Today, even the smallest blade triggers alarms and confiscation. Travelers learn quickly to leave sharp objects at home or face having them seized forever. The shift happened fast, driven by events that made the world rethink what belonged inside an aircraft cabin. Meeting loved ones directly at the departure gate was one of the most emotional rituals of air travel in the 1970s, when families walked together through terminals until the very last moment before boarding began. Parents hugged their children at the gate entrance, grandparents waved through windows as planes pulled away, and couples shared long embraces in full view of other passengers waiting nearby. Nobody needed a ticket to enter the terminal beyond the front doors. Security checkpoints existed, but they were brief and welcoming, treating everyone as guests rather than suspects. Friends arrived early just to sit with travelers and share a final cup of coffee before the flight. The gate area felt like an extension of the waiting room, filled with laughter, tears, and promises to write or call. It was a time when saying goodbye happened face-to-face, not through text messages sent from a distant curb. Today, only ticketed passengers pass beyond security, and loved ones wait in lobbies far removed from boarding. The intimate farewells that once defined departures have been replaced by sterile checkpoints prioritizing safety over sentiment. Walking around freely during takeoff and landing was something passengers did without much concern in the 1970s, treating the cabin like a living room where movement was a personal choice. People stood to grab items from overhead bins, stretched their legs in the aisle, and chatted with friends seated rows away while the plane climbed or descended. Flight attendants reminded travelers to sit, but enforcement was gentle, almost apologetic. Parents let children wander to visit relatives in other sections, and businessmen stood adjusting luggage even as the wheels left the runway. The aircraft shook and tilted, yet passengers seemed unbothered by the physics of flight that made standing dangerous. Pilots made announcements about seatbelts, but the tone suggested suggestions rather than commands. It was an era of personal responsibility, where individuals decided their own comfort and risk. Today, seatbelt signs mean exactly what they say. Flight attendants enforce compliance firmly, and anyone refusing to sit faces consequences ranging from warnings to removal from future flights. The casual strolls that once felt harmless have been redefined as safety violations. Bringing wrapped gifts through security without screening was a holiday tradition in the 1970s when travelers arrived at airports carrying beautifully decorated packages meant for loved ones waiting at their destination. Nobody asked what was inside the shiny paper and ribbons. Security guards smiled at the festive spirit and waved people through without demanding that presents be opened. Families packed fragile ornaments, surprise toys, and carefully chosen keepsakes, trusting that their wrapping would survive intact. Children clutched boxes they were forbidden to peek inside, adding to the excitement of travel. The airport felt magical during the holiday season, with passengers carrying armfuls of gifts through terminals decorated with lights. It was an era when trust extended even to mysterious packages because hiding something dangerous inside a wrapped box seemed absurd. Today, security officers require that all packages be unwrapped or scanned before passing through checkpoints. Travelers learn quickly to leave gifts unsealed or risk having them opened by gloved hands under fluorescent lights. The magic of carrying a secret surprise has been replaced by practical reality. Flying without showing any form of identification was perfectly normal in the 1970s, when a paper ticket was the only thing standing between a traveler and their seat on the plane. People bought tickets at counters using cash, gave whatever name they chose, and walked directly to the gate without anyone verifying who they actually were. Families traveling together handed over a stack of tickets, and agents processed them without matching faces to documents. Business travelers moved through airports like ghosts, anonymous and unbothered by questions about identity. The system operated on trust, assuming that anyone purchasing a ticket intended to travel peacefully. Photo identification existed, but airlines rarely demanded it. Driver's licenses stayed in wallets unless international travel required them. The ease of it all feels almost impossible to imagine today. Modern airports require government-issued identification at multiple checkpoints, matching names against databases with unforgiving precision. Travelers without proper documentation are turned away regardless of their tickets. What was once as simple as handing over a slip of paper now requires verified proof that you are exactly who you claim to be. Holding babies in your lap without car seats or restraints was standard practice in the 1970s, when infants were considered extensions of their parents rather than separate passengers requiring their own safety equipment. Mothers cradled newborns throughout entire flights, shifting them during turbulence and holding tight during landings without anyone suggesting a better method. Airlines did not require tickets for lap children under a certain age, making family travel affordable but far less secure. Flight attendants offered extra pillows and blankets to help parents manage, but car seats were bulky items that stayed at home. The idea that a child needed to be strapped into an approved device seemed excessive. Parents trusted their arms to protect their babies the same way generations before them had done in cars, trains, and buses. It was an era when personal judgment guided decisions about child safety. Today, airlines strongly encourage and often require approved car seats for infants, and regulations have tightened around how young children must be secured. The casual days of bouncing a baby on your knee at 30,000 feet have given way to strict guidelines. Bringing large pets into the cabin without approved carriers was something travelers managed with surprising ease in the 1970s, when airlines treated animals as passengers rather than regulated cargo. Dogs sat beside their owners on empty seats, cats curled up in laps during long flights, and nobody demanded paperwork proving the animal's health or temperament. Families traveling with pets simply walked on board and found a spot where everyone could settle comfortably. Flight attendants occasionally offered water bowls, treating four-legged travelers with hospitality extended to humans. The cabin sometimes smelled of fur and barks echoed through aisles, but passengers accepted it as part of the communal experience. There were no weight limits, no carrier dimensions to measure, and no fees beyond the standard ticket price for an extra seat. People trusted that pet owners knew their animals well enough to keep them controlled. Today, strict regulations govern every aspect of flying with animals. Carriers must meet specific size requirements, and health certificates are mandatory. The easygoing days of traveling alongside an unleashed companion have been replaced by rules designed to protect everyone. Drinking your own alcohol openly during the flight was a freedom passengers enjoyed without hesitation in the 1970s, when nobody questioned what you pulled from your bag once the plane reached cruising altitude. Travelers uncorked wine bottles, poured whiskey into plastic cups, and shared flasks with seatmates as casually as passing around a bag of peanuts. Flight attendants rarely intervened because personal consumption was considered a private matter. People packed their favorite drinks specifically for long flights, knowing airline offerings were limited and expensive. The atmosphere felt almost like a social club in the sky, where adults made their own choices about how to pass the hours. Some passengers mixed cocktails at their seats while chatting with strangers. The freedom to drink what you brought felt like a basic right rather than a privilege. Today, federal regulations prohibit consuming any alcohol not served by the airline, and violators face fines, removal from flights, and potential bans. The open bottles and personal flasks that once made flying feel relaxed have been replaced by strict service rules. Switching seats freely without asking permission was something passengers did constantly in the 1970s, treating the cabin like an open seating arrangement where you settled wherever felt comfortable. Families separated during booking simply moved together once boarding finished, claiming empty rows without waiting for approval. Business travelers upgraded themselves to first class if seats sat vacant. Flight attendants watched these migrations with indifference, more concerned with service than seating charts. Friends traveling on the same flight found each other and rearranged sections to sit together. The concept of assigned seating existed, but enforcement was practically non-existent once doors closed. People spread across empty rows to sleep, moved away from crying babies, and claimed window seats they had not paid for. The cabin felt flexible and accommodating to personal preferences. Today, seat assignments are tracked digitally and enforced strictly. Moving without permission can trigger confrontations with crew members, and upgrading yourself carries serious consequences. What once felt like harmless freedom has become a regulated system where every seat belongs to someone specific. Carrying firearms in checked luggage without declaration was something hunters and sportsmen did routinely in the 1970s. tossing guns into suitcases alongside clothes and toiletries. Nobody asked whether your bag contained weapons, and baggage handlers had no idea what they were loading into cargo holds. Families traveling for hunting trips packed rifles without paperwork, trusting that their property would arrive safely. The system operated on assumption rather than verification, believing most travelers had legitimate reasons for whatever they carried. Airport security focused on cabin threats rather than checked baggage contents. Guns moved through the system invisibly, part of the normal flow of luggage nobody examined too closely. Travelers felt entitled to bring their possessions without explaining what they owned. Today, firearms require formal declaration, approved locking cases, and separation of ammunition. Failure to declare a weapon triggers immediate investigation, potential arrest, and serious federal charges. The casual days of packing guns like any other belonging have been replaced by strict protocols designed to track every weapon entering the aviation system. Joking about bombs or hijacking at the airport was something travelers did carelessly in the 1970s, tossing off remarks that today would end in handcuffs and federal charges. People made wisecracks about explosive luggage, pretended their bags contained weapons, and laughed about hijacking planes to tropical destinations. Security personnel sometimes chuckled along, treating these comments as harmless humor rather than credible threats. The atmosphere at airports felt casual enough that dark jokes blended into normal conversation without raising alarms. Travelers tested boundaries constantly, unaware that their words could someday carry legal weight. Parents joked in front of children, business travelers bantered with agents, and everyone assumed obvious sarcasm needed no explanation. The line between humor and threat barely existed because genuine danger seemed remote. Today, any mention of bombs, weapons, or hijacking triggers immediate response from security teams trained to treat every statement seriously. Arrests happen quickly, flights are delayed, and travelers face prosecution regardless of intent. What once passed as nervous humor now carries consequences that can reshape lives. Leaving luggage unattended in terminal areas was something travelers did constantly in the 1970s, setting bags beside benches while they wandered off to buy magazines, use restrooms, or grab a quick meal. Nobody panicked at the sight of an ownerless suitcase sitting quietly near a gate. Airports felt like bus stations where personal property stayed safe through mutual trust rather than constant surveillance. Travelers left bags to hold their place in line, dropped briefcases while making phone calls, and trusted that everything would remain untouched until they returned. Security guards walked past unattended luggage without a second glance, assuming owners were nearby. The atmosphere felt relaxed, almost neighborly, as if the terminal were an extension of a living room where belongings stayed safe on their own. Today, any unattended bag triggers immediate response. Announcements blast through speakers, security teams converge, and bomb squads are called if owners cannot be located quickly. Entire terminals evacuate over forgotten backpacks. The casual days of leaving luggage while you stretched your legs have been replaced by vigilance that treats every orphaned item as a potential threat. Boarding flights without removing shoes or belts was the standard experience in the 1970s, when security checkpoints meant walking through a metal detector while fully dressed and moving on with your day. Nobody asked travelers to strip down layers of clothing or empty pockets into plastic bins. Shoes stayed on feet where they belonged, belts held up pants without question, and the idea of exposing socks to airport floors would have seemed absurd. Security focused on obvious metal objects rather than hidden compartments in footwear or accessories. Travelers breezed through checkpoints in seconds, barely breaking stride between the terminal entrance and their departure gate. The process felt dignified, efficient, and respectful of personal space. Lines moved quickly because inspections required nothing more than a brief pause and a confident step forward. Today, shoes come off, belts slide into bins, and travelers shuffle through scanners in varying states of undress. The rituals of modern security add time, inconvenience, and a strange intimacy to every journey. What once took seconds now requires patience, preparation, and acceptance that privacy ends the moment you enter the screening area. Carrying lighters and matches without restriction was completely normal in the 1970s, when fire-starting tools were considered personal items, no different from pens or wallets. Smokers packed multiple lighters in carry-on bags, matchbooks filled pockets, and nobody questioned why someone needed flame at 30,000 feet. Security checkpoints ignored these items entirely, focusing on larger threats rather than pocket-sized conveniences. Travelers lit cigarettes the moment they boarded, so having fire readily available made perfect sense. Gift shop displays sold decorative lighters as souvenirs, and passengers tucked them into bags without concern. The idea that a simple lighter could pose a security threat seemed laughable to anyone who used them daily. Matches came free with every pack of cigarettes, accumulating in pockets and bags like spare change. Today, regulations restrict lighters to specific types and limit matches to small quantities carried on your person. Torch lighters face outright bans, and anything resembling an unusual ignition device triggers confiscation. The casual relationship travelers once had with fire has been replaced by rules that treat every flame source as a potential danger. Taking photographs anywhere inside the airport was something travelers did freely in the 1970s, capturing memories of departures, arrivals, and everything in between without anyone objecting. Families posed beside departure boards, children pressed faces against windows watching planes taxi, and tourists documented gleaming terminals as proudly as any landmark. Security personnel paid no attention to cameras clicking throughout the building. The airport felt like part of the travel experience worth preserving on film. People photographed pilots, flight attendants, and even security checkpoints without triggering concern. The atmosphere welcomed documentation because transparency signaled nothing to hide. Postcards featured airport architecture, and travelers mailed images of terminals alongside beach photos. Today, photography restrictions vary by airport, with certain areas completely off limits to cameras. Security checkpoints, screening equipment, and operational areas carry explicit bans that trigger confrontations if violated. The freedom to document every moment of travel has been replaced by rules that treat certain images as potential threats worth preventing entirely. Purchasing tickets for someone else to travel under their own name was routine business in the 1970s, when companies bought flights for employees, parents sent children on trips, and friends gifted travel without complications. The person paying and the person flying had no required connection beyond the exchange of a paper ticket. Travel agents processed bookings without verifying relationships between buyers and travelers. Corporate accounts covered flights for anyone the company designated, and personal gifts of airline tickets felt as simple as buying concert seats for a friend. Names on tickets mattered only for boarding calls, not identity verification. The system trusted that whoever held the ticket belonged on the plane. Families coordinated travel across generations, with grandparents purchasing flights for grandchildren they might never meet at the airport. Today, identification requirements tie tickets directly to verified travelers, and purchasing flights for others involves additional documentation and security checks. The casual days of gifting travel without paperwork have been replaced by systems designed to confirm that every ticket connects to a confirmed identity. Greeting arriving passengers directly at the gate was one of the most heartwarming traditions of air travel in the 1970s, when families gathered with flowers, balloons, and handmade signs right where travelers emerged from the jetway. Children spotted parents before they even reached the terminal, running toward them with outstretched arms, while other passengers smiled at the reunion. The gate area served as a celebration space where tears flowed freely and hugs lasted long enough to block foot traffic. Grandparents met grandchildren for the first time steps away from the aircraft door. Soldiers returned from deployment to crowds of loved ones pressed against rope lines that barely held them back. The moment felt immediate, intimate, and charged with emotion that only proximity could deliver. Nobody needed tickets to witness these arrivals, and terminals buzzed with anticipation whenever flights landed. Today, security barriers push greeters far from gates, relegating reunions to baggage claim areas or terminal exits. The intimate welcomes that once defined arrivals have been replaced by distant waves and delayed embraces that happen only after travelers clear the secured zone. Carrying tools like screwdrivers and wrenches in carry-on bags was something tradesmen did without hesitation in the 1970s, packing toolkits alongside clothes for business trips that required both meetings and repairs. Nobody questioned why a passenger needed a hammer or pliers at their destination. Security glanced at bags without concern because tools were tools, not threats. Contractors flew with everything they needed to complete jobs, trusting that their equipment would pass through checkpoints as easily as briefcases. The idea that a screwdriver could be classified as a weapon seemed absurd to people who used them daily for honest work. Travelers packed drills, wrenches, and utility knives without separating them into checked luggage. The system assumed good intentions and practical purposes. Today, tools over 7 inches are banned from cabins entirely, and anything resembling a weapon triggers confiscation and questioning. Handymen now check their toolkits or ship them ahead, adding cost and inconvenience to every working trip. The casual days of traveling with everything you needed in one bag have been replaced by strict size limits that treat every tool as a potential danger. Boarding without going through metal detectors was possible at many small airports in the 1970s, where security infrastructure simply did not exist. Regional terminals operated like bus stations, with passengers walking directly from parking lots to gates without encountering a single checkpoint. Nobody scanned bags, nobody waved wands, and nobody asked questions about what you carried. The honor system governed air travel at these locations, trusting passengers posed no threat simply because they purchased tickets. Small communities knew their travelers by name, and formal security felt unnecessary in places where everyone recognized everyone else. The atmosphere was neighborly, relaxed, and built entirely on assumptions that seem naive today. Families boarded puddle jumpers with picnic baskets and hunting gear without anyone inspecting their belongings. Today, every airport, regardless of size, requires passengers to pass through detection systems before boarding. Federal mandates leave no exceptions, and the informal trust that once governed small terminals has been replaced by uniform screening that treats every traveler the same. Bringing sports equipment like baseball bats onto the plane was something athletes did regularly in the 1970s, carrying gear into cabins rather than risking damage in checked luggage. Players stowed bats in overhead bins, golfers carried clubs down the aisle, and hockey players wedged sticks into storage compartments designed for coats and briefcases. Nobody questioned why someone needed sporting equipment within arm's reach during flight. The assumption was practical rather than paranoid, believing athletes simply wanted to protect their valuable gear from baggage handlers. Parents traveling with children brought bats for Little League games waiting at their destination, treating them no differently than toys or books. The cabin accommodated these items because refusing them seemed unnecessarily restrictive. Today, bats, clubs, hockey sticks, and similar equipment must be checked without exception. Security classifies them as potential bludgeons regardless of the owner's intent. The casual days of keeping your gear close have been replaced by mandatory separation that treats every solid object as a possible weapon. Standing in the aisle to stretch during the entire flight was something passengers did freely in the 1970s, treating the narrow corridor between seats as a communal space for movement and conversation. People stood for long stretches, chatting with fellow travelers, doing light exercises, or simply escaping the cramped confines of their assigned seats. Flight attendants navigated around them with practiced patience, rarely asking anyone to sit unless meal service required clear passage. The aisle belonged to everyone, and blocking it briefly seemed like a reasonable trade for comfort on long journeys. Passengers gathered near galleys and lavatories, forming small social clusters that made flights feel less isolating. The freedom to move created an atmosphere of shared experience rather than individual confinement. Today, crew members enforce seated positions far more strictly, citing safety regulations and service requirements. Standing without purpose draws attention and requests to return to your seat. The casual aisle gatherings that once broke the monotony of flight have been replaced by rules that keep passengers contained and predictable. Tipping flight attendants directly with cash was a gesture of gratitude passengers offered freely in the 1970s, pressing bills into hands after particularly helpful service or memorable interactions. Travelers showed appreciation the same way they would at restaurants or hotels, believing personal recognition deserved personal reward. Flight attendants accepted these tips graciously, tucking them into pockets with genuine smiles and heartfelt thanks. The exchange felt natural, a simple transaction between people who had shared hours together in close quarters. Nobody questioned whether tips were appropriate or whether accepting them violated any policy. Service in the sky mirrored service on the ground, where cash rewards signaled satisfaction. Parents encouraged children to offer tips after kind attendants brought extra snacks or helped with coloring books. Today, most airlines explicitly prohibit staff from accepting gratuities, citing company policies and concerns about favoritism. The personal gesture that once connected passengers and crew has been replaced by corporate guidelines that keep all transactions formal. Leaded gasoline was the scent of every gas station and the invisible cloud trailing every school bus. It made cars run smoother and engines knock less, so people thought it was a miracle fuel. You'd roll down the windows, sit in the back seat without a seatbelt, and breathe it all in like it was part of the road trip experience. Kids pumped gas. Adults wiped their hands with a rag and got right back behind the wheel. The lead helped your engine, but it quietly poisoned everything else: air, soil, and especially young brains. Over time, researchers found links between lead exposure and learning disabilities, developmental delays, and even violent behavior later in life. But in the 1970s, it was standard. Unleaded options only started to pop up near the end of the decade, and most people ignored them. Gas smelled strong. It meant power. It meant you were going somewhere. Nobody questioned it. Until the studies started piling up and regulations followed. Leaded gas was phased out over time and officially banned in the United States in 1996, long after many of us had already. Riding in the open beds of pickup trucks was more than just normal in the 1980s. It was a childhood rite of passage. You can still remember the feeling of the wind slapping your cheeks as the truck bounced down dusty back roads or sped along highways, your legs braced and your hands gripping the cool metal rails. There was no seatbelt, no cushion, just you, the sky, and maybe a sibling or two clinging beside you, giggling or yelling at passing cars. Parents did not think twice. It was just how things were done. Tailgates were for hauling lumber and hauling children. But today, in most states, it is illegal to ride in the bed of a pickup truck unless you are a farm worker or under specific exceptions. Authorities now call it dangerous, irresponsible, unthinkable. But for those who grew up in the 80s, it was freedom on four wheels. If bouncing around in the back of a pickup sounds wild by today's standards, wait until you remember what kids were doing completely unsupervised just a few blocks from home. There was a time when a homemade dune buggy could cruise down Main Street without so much as a raised eyebrow. All you needed was an old Volkswagen Beetle chassis, a few hours in the garage, and a wild sense of adventure. These do-it-yourself buggies were chopped, stripped, and rebuilt with bare-bones frames, zero doors, and roll cages that were more decorative than practical. People drove them right onto public highways. No seatbelts, no blinkers, just raw fun and open-air chaos. Some states even allowed them to be registered with little more than a photo and a handshake. And since emissions testing was still in its awkward teenage years, nobody cared if it smelled like you were burning old tires. It all added up to a uniquely rebellious era of backyard brilliance. Of course, modern safety regulators eventually caught on. By the time the 1980s rolled around, you needed a whole lot more than a wrench and a dream to make one of these legal. And if that sounds crazy, wait until you hear how high you could lift your truck without anyone blinking an eye. No seatbelts in cars were just a fact of life in the 1950s. Families would pile into their station wagons, kids sprawled across the back seats, parents up front, and no one thought twice about safety restraints. At the time, cars were seen as symbols of freedom and style, not machines that needed strict safety rules. Most models were built for looks and comfort rather than accident protection. Lap belts technically existed in some vehicles, but they were considered optional extras that very few buyers bothered with. In fact, many drivers saw them as unnecessary or even dangerous. worrying that they might trap them inside during a crash or a fire. Looking back now, it is shocking to think about just how casual people were about driving safety. Parents would let kids sit on their laps while steering, or let toddlers nap in the back window shelf with the sun beating down. Police did not enforce seatbelt use because there were no laws to enforce. It was not until the late 1960s that seatbelts became standard equipment in American cars, and not until the 1980s that states began passing laws requiring their use. By then, decades of tragic accidents had proven the cost of going without. Still, to people who grew up in the 1950s, the memory of piling into the car with no restraints at all is strangely nostalgic, even though today it would be considered completely illegal and irresponsible. Asbestos ceiling tiles and insulation were practically a design trend in the 1970s. You saw those popcorn ceilings and fuzzy-looking pipe wrappings in homes, schools, offices, everywhere. Nobody warned you not to touch it. Nobody wore masks when cutting into it. In fact, it was marketed as a safety feature, fire-resistant, soundproof, and easy to install. It was the miracle material that builders swore by, and people loved how quiet it made things. Kids sat through classes under ceilings full of it. Parents hung out in basements lined with it. But what no one knew, or chose to ignore, was how the fibers could break loose, float into your lungs, and stay there forever. Asbestos exposure doesn't cause immediate symptoms. It creeps in years later, showing up as mesothelioma or lung disease long after the danger is gone. Once science caught up, the lawsuits started. Suddenly, that fluffy insulation was a lawsuit waiting to happen. Contractors had to wear hazmat suits just to remove it, and homeowners were left wondering how many years they had breathed it in. Today, it's banned in most uses and strictly regulated in others. But back then, it was part of the wallpaper of life. And if the walls and ceilings weren't enough, your first aid kit might have been just as questionable. Letting kids roam the neighborhood alone was not just common in the 1980s, it was encouraged. Children would vanish after breakfast with a bike, a baseball glove, or just their imagination, and no one blinked an eye. They played near rivers, railroad tracks, junkyards, and alleys. They climbed trees and empty lots, chased each other through sprinkler-soaked lawns, and explored storm drains without ever considering the danger. No cell phones, no GPS. Just a promise to be back before dark, maybe. You followed the smell of backyard barbecue or the jingle of the ice cream truck to know where everyone had gathered. The streets raised them. Strangers were just people you had not met yet. The rule was simple. Stay together, watch out for your younger sibling, and come home when the porch lights came on. Parents trusted the neighborhood, and the neighborhood often looked out for them. There was an unspoken safety net woven through the community, invisible but strong. But today, letting a 10-year-old walk to the park alone can spark a visit from child services. Some parents have even faced legal charges for giving their kids the same freedom they once enjoyed. What was once viewed as independence is now labeled negligence. The culture of watchful fear has replaced the freedom of wandering youth. But if that sounds unsettling, it is nothing compared to what used to happen behind the wheel, while kids were in the back seat. Back in the 1970s, monster trucks were not just something you saw at arena shows. They were rolling through neighborhoods like local legends. Drivers would lift their trucks sky high with no thought to rollover danger, center of gravity, or whether they could actually park the thing in their own driveway. Tires the size of bathtubs? Absolutely. No visible license plate? Who was looking? There were no limits to how high you could lift your suspension or how ridiculous your truck looked. If you needed a ladder to get in, you were doing it right. Police officers rarely pulled them over because, honestly, it was not even illegal yet. No one was worried about crash test ratings or pedestrian safety zones, and the idea of stability control was still hanging out in a notebook somewhere in Detroit. Today, height restrictions and suspension laws make sure your ride does not double as a climbing wall. But back then, the bigger the better. And the louder, the cooler. Speaking of things that would make today's DMV faint, let us talk about tractors. Yes, actual tractors, cruising down country roads without plates or papers. Pregnant women drinking and smoking publicly in the 1950s was not only accepted, It was practically expected in some social circles. Cigarettes were marketed as stress relievers, and alcohol was considered a normal part of dinner or social gatherings. You could walk into a restaurant and see expectant mothers enjoying cocktails with friends, or standing outside department stores smoking a cigarette without anyone batting an eye. It was not until the 1960s and beyond that serious studies showed the dangers of fetal alcohol syndrome and low birth weights from smoking during pregnancy. But in the 1950s, women who were expecting a child were not shielded from cigarettes or liquor at all. Looking back now, it feels almost surreal that society normalized these practices, but for millions of families at the time, it was just another part of daily life. Today, a pregnant woman drinking or smoking in public would spark outrage, but in the 1950s, it was totally normal. Mercury thermometers were in every medicine cabinet, usually tucked behind a box of cotton balls or a half-used bottle of rubbing alcohol. They looked like tiny magic wands, glass, delicate, and filled with shimmering silver liquid. Getting your temperature taken meant shaking it down like a maraca, then holding it under your tongue without accidentally biting it in half. But if one broke, no big deal. You'd gather up the scattered beads of mercury with a paper towel or chase them across the bathroom floor for fun. The liquid rolled like little metal marbles and seemed totally harmless. It was even mesmerizing, but that shiny stuff is toxic. Breathing in mercury vapor, especially in small enclosed rooms, can damage your lungs, brain, and kidneys. And yet, in the 1970s, nobody worried. Pediatricians used them daily. Schools had them on hand. And the warnings? Barely a whisper. Once digital thermometers became cheaper and more reliable, the mercury version faded away. Today, even the tiniest spill triggers a full hazmat response. But back then, it was just another part of being sick. And if you were sick at home in the 70s, chances are you were surrounded by something just as colorful and even more dangerous. Driving after a few beers was seen as a minor risk, not a moral failing. In the 1980s, drinking and driving was common, so common it barely raised an eyebrow. Someone would leave a barbecue or a bowling alley, buzzed but smiling, and climb behind the wheel like it was just another Tuesday night. Sometimes they even brought a drink with them for the road, nestled between their legs or sitting in the cup holder before cup holders even existed. You might remember the clink of bottles under the seat or the faint scent of beer still on your uncle's breath as he drove you home. Nobody called it reckless. Nobody flinched. It was treated the same way as driving tired or driving in the rain. Risky, sure, but manageable if you knew what you were doing. Breathalyzers were rare. Police might give a warning, not a ticket. Getting pulled over meant a brief conversation, not a night in jail. Today, of course, the laws have changed, and for good reason. Drunk driving kills thousands. Campaigns like Mothers Against Drunk Driving helped turn the tide, showing the public what casual drinking behind the wheel really cost. But back then, it was not about recklessness. It was about a culture that had not yet connected its habits with their consequences. And if the idea of casual drinking while driving sounds dangerous now, just imagine what the air was like inside your favorite restaurant. In the 1970s, if you lived out in the country and owned a tractor, you basically owned a car, a truck, and a parade float all in one. Tractors were not just for farms, they were the rural equivalent of a commuter vehicle. Need to get to the store? Take the tractor. Dropping by your neighbor's house 3 miles down a dirt road? Tractor again. There was no need for plates, registration, or insurance. The rules were simple. If it moved and it did not break anything, it was fair game. Authorities looked the other way because honestly, who was going to ticket the guy who also grew their corn? It was a slower time, and we mean that literally. You would see 20-mile-per-hour traffic jams with a full line of cars behind one of these beasts, and no one really minded. Today, you need plates, reflectors, and often a permit to drive a tractor even a block away from your land. But back then, tractors were as common on rural roads as pickup trucks, and a whole lot louder. Asbestos was everywhere in the 1950s. It was woven into the very walls and floors of homes, schools, and public buildings, and no one thought twice about it. The fibrous mineral was cheap, fire-resistant and strong, making it a favorite material for insulation, ceiling tiles, floor tiles, and even toys. At the time, few people linked the mineral to the lung diseases and cancers that would later devastate entire generations. By the 1970s, medical research had revealed the dangers of asbestos exposure, and regulations began phasing it out. Today, its use is banned in many forms, and strict removal procedures are required if it is discovered in old buildings. Looking back, it feels chilling to realize how something once considered a household necessity is now recognized as one of the most hazardous building materials ever used. What was normal then would never be allowed today. Lead-based house paint was on everything, from the trim around your bedroom window to the alphabet blocks you chewed on. It came in brilliant colors: fire engine red, bright yellow, deep green. The more vibrant, the more lead. It was marketed as durable and washable, perfect for messy kids. And boy, did it chip. You'd peel it off windowsills out of boredom or scrape it with your nails without thinking twice. It crumbled into dust that settled into the carpet, got tracked into kitchens, and ended up in the air. Small hands touched it, then mouths. It didn't smell weird. It didn't taste odd. It just quietly poisoned millions of children across the country, lowering IQs and increasing behavioral issues without a single obvious symptom. Entire neighborhoods, especially older ones, were coated in the stuff. Lead paint wasn't banned in residential use until 1978, and even after that, it stayed in homes for decades. Removing it required hazmat suits and special permits. And still, many families had no idea it was even there. It was a silent danger, one that hid in plain sight and looked great doing it. And while the walls might have been risky, the pajamas you wore to bed came with their own fire-breathing surprise. Smoking was everywhere in the 1980s. Not just on sidewalks or street corners, but inside diners, airplanes, grocery stores, even hospitals. Ashtrays were bolted to fast food tables. The clink of ice in a glass mixed with the flick of a lighter. Office meetings were held through a fog of cigarette smoke. Passengers lit up at 30,000 feet in a sealed cabin, and nobody said a word. There were smoking sections in restaurants, but no real barriers. Just a vague separation by aisle or air vent. It was part of the scenery, part of the culture. But today, smoking indoors is banned in most public spaces across the United States. What once symbolized adulthood now reads as a health hazard. But at the time, it was just background noise, something that hung in the curtains and clung to your coat. And if the air in those spaces was thick with smoke, it was also filled with something else that seems almost unbelievable now: medicine sold without oversight. Get this. In the 1970s, there was no law stopping you from turning an old school bus into your family's home on wheels. You could snag a decommissioned bus for next to nothing, rip out the seats, toss in a mattress, a couple beanbags, and maybe a stovetop, and call it a camper. No certification, no inspections, no zoning permits, just pure imagination and the scent of diesel. Families would paint them wild colors, load them with mismatched furniture, and hit the road like modern pioneers. They did not have running water. Some barely had brakes. But they were mobile, cozy, and dirt cheap. There was something kind of magical about the idea. Taking your whole life, putting it on a bus, and driving until the road ran out. Today, you would need to pass a dozen inspections just to get halfway down the street. But in the 1970s, you did not need a license to be an adventure seeker on wheels. Now, if you thought turning a school bus into a camper was daring, wait until you hear about the three-wheeled wonders that are claimed to be safer than a sedan. Cigarette vending machines were once a familiar sight in the 1950s, found in restaurants, bowling alleys, bus stations, and even hotel lobbies. All it took was a handful of coins, and out slid a fresh pack of cigarettes. Children could and often did purchase cigarettes directly from these machines without anyone stopping them. At the time, smoking was so normalized that no one thought vending machines were inappropriate. As the dangers of smoking became undeniable, governments began to regulate vending machines more heavily. By the 1990s and 2000s, most states banned them altogether except in adult-only venues. Today, The thought of a child pulling a cigarette pack from a machine feels absurd, but in the 1950s, it was part of daily life. That casual access is exactly why this once normal practice is now completely illegal. Flame-retardant pajamas with PBDEs were supposed to be the ultimate kid-safe sleepwear. You'd slip into those polyester two-pieces printed with race cars or unicorns, and your parents could sleep easy, knowing you were protected. After all, they were labeled flame-resistant, right? But what they didn't say was what made them that way: a chemical cocktail of polybrominated diphenyl ethers, PBDES for short. These compounds were added to fabrics to make them melt instead of burn, which sounds safe. Until you realize the fumes were toxic, the materials didn't breathe, and the chemicals absorbed right through your skin. Studies later linked PBDEs to hormone disruption, developmental delays, and even behavioral issues. And we were wearing them every night. In summer, they clung to sweaty skin like a wet plastic bag. In winter, they sparked with static and held onto every scent in the house. Parents meant well. They were doing what the labels told them. But science eventually caught up, and those pajamas quietly disappeared from store shelves. Today, you'd be hard-pressed to find a kid's outfit with those same flame-retardant additives. But back in the 70s, if it said safe, people trusted it, even if it smelled like melted crayons. And just beyond the back door, an even bigger danger was sprayed on like a blessing. Buying cold medicine used to be as easy as grabbing a candy bar. In the 1980s, if you had a stuffy nose, you walked into the drugstore, picked up a box of Sudafed, paid in cash, and left. No questions asked, no identification, no tracking. Parents sent their kids to buy it. It was just medicine, part of every household. But the main ingredient in many of those over-the-counter remedies, pseudoephedrine, was later linked to illegal methamphetamine production. By the early 2000s, laws changed. Now, you need to show identification, sign a logbook, and face strict limits on how much you can buy. The shelves are locked. The trust is gone. And what used to be a quick stop for relief has turned into a regulated transaction. But before children were regulated at pharmacies, they were doing something else just as shocking in the family car, standing tall while it moved. Three-wheeled tri-cars were one of the stranger automotive experiments to come out of the 1970s, and somehow they were totally legal to drive on regular roads. Companies like Dale and Myers tried to pitch these oddball vehicles as the future of safe, affordable transportation. But here's the twist: they were wildly unstable. They looked like space pods, handled like shopping carts, and tipped over if you so much as looked at a corner the wrong way. Some of them were so light, two people could lift one side off the ground. Still, they were street legal. There were no strict safety standards for this sort of thing, and as long as it had a license plate and functioning lights, it could hit the road. The idea was to offer fuel efficiency and savings during the oil crisis, but in practice, they were more likely to cause whiplash than save gas. That did not stop eager drivers from picking them up and zooming around town like extras from a science fiction movie. Today, these vehicles have either vanished completely or landed in museums as cautionary tales. But if that sounds bizarre, just wait until we tell you about kids riding gas-powered mini bikes down neighborhood sidewalks like it was no big deal. Drinking alcohol while driving was not only common in the 1950s, it was often seen as harmless. Many states had no open container laws, meaning drivers could sip a beer or a cocktail on the road without legal consequence. Law enforcement generally turned a blind eye unless someone was visibly drunk, and even then the punishments were lighter than what we would consider appropriate today. Families often thought nothing of it, with kids in the back seat while parents enjoyed a drink up front. It was only as accidents mounted and drunk driving became recognized as a national crisis that laws began to change. Today, the idea of drinking alcohol behind the wheel is unthinkable and harshly punished. In the 1950s, however, it was just another extension of the era's more carefree and less regulated lifestyle. What once seemed ordinary now feels dangerous and reckless, but back then it was part of everyday American culture. Lawn chemicals with DDT were sprayed across suburban America like miracle dust. In the 1970s, Lush green grass was practically a status symbol, and DDT was the secret weapon. It promised to kill bugs, weeds, and just about anything that dared disturb your tidy front yard. Garden hoses were connected to chemical sprayers, and entire blocks smelled like synthetic citrus and poison. Nobody warned you to stay inside. In fact, kids ran barefoot through freshly treated lawns, chasing sprinklers and dodging dandelions while their skin soaked in the residue. Pets rolled in it, parents barbecued on it, and when rain hit, those chemicals went straight into the sidewalk gutters. DDT had already raised alarms in scientific circles, but in neighborhoods everywhere, it was just another tool in the garage. The packaging featured sunny lawns and happy families, not skulls or warnings. It wasn't uncommon to see a bottle of weed killer sitting on the porch next to the lemonade. By the late 1970s, it was banned for agricultural use in the United States. But traces lingered in soil and water for years. It affected birds, fish, children, pretty much everything it touched. Today, DDT is infamous for its lasting environmental impact and connection to declining wildlife populations. But back then, it was just part of Saturday chores. And if your lawn didn't smell like chemicals, your furniture definitely did. Letting kids ride standing up in the back seat was not just overlooked. It was often encouraged. The space between the two front seats was a coveted spot, a mini stage where children stood to give directions, tell stories, or just feel taller. It felt like driving without actually driving. Parents drove with one arm loosely draped over the passenger seat while a child stood between them, gripping the dashboard, peering out at the road like a co-pilot. In the back, kids slid across vinyl seats, bounced with each turn, or lay down and stared at the ceiling. There were no reminders to buckle up, because buckling up was not yet a rule. It was a nuisance. The seatbelt often stayed buried beneath the cushions or was jammed into the crack between the seats. Today, it is illegal for a child to ride without a proper car seat or restraint. Parents now face fines, or worse, for what was once everyday family travel. But back then, riding unrestrained was just another way to feel free. There was trust, or maybe just oblivion. Either way, it was the norm. And if today's laws would call that reckless, the next parenting habit would cause even more of an uproar. It took place in plain sight, often with a crowd watching. If you were a kid in the 1970s and you did not have a gas-powered mini bike, were you even really living? These things were like pocket-sized motorcycles. No license required, no helmets expected, and no real supervision in sight. You would see kids as young as 10 zipping down sidewalks, through alleyways, and even across busy intersections, acting like they were in some kind of stunt show. The engines were loud, the brakes were questionable, and the safety gear was usually just a baseball cap. But nobody really cared. Parents would wave from the porch and tell them to be home by dinner. And the best part? These bikes were cheap enough that a few months of lawn mowing or paper routes could get you one. Police might stop and give a warning, but more often than not, they would just shrug and let you ride. It was pure chaos disguised as childhood freedom. Today, if you so much as start one of these in a neighborhood, someone is calling the authorities before you hit second gear. But back then, it was just how kids got around. Now imagine that same freedom, but with full-grown adults riding choppers that looked more like medieval jousting weapons than actual motorcycles. LEED paint-coated homes, furniture, and toys throughout the 1950s. Bright, durable, and cheap, it seemed like the perfect material for parents who wanted colorful nurseries or sturdy cribs. Toy makers splashed it on blocks, model cars, and dolls without hesitation. The sweet taste of lead paint chips, as many survivors recall, made the danger even more insidious. By the late 1970s, the health consequences became undeniable, and lead paint was banned for residential use. Today, homes built before those bans often require costly inspections and lead removal projects to make them safe. In the 1950s, it was just another Saturday project to repaint the family home. What was considered normal then is now recognized as one of the greatest household hazards of the past century, and it serves as a stark reminder of how much has changed in just a few decades. PCBs in electrical devices were practically ACL materials, non-flammable, chemically stable, and fantastic at insulating electricity, but also toxic to humans, wildlife, and everything in between. Schools, offices, and homes with fluorescent lighting often had PCBs lurking in the ballasts overhead. When the ballasts overheated or leaked, those oily fluids dripped into ceilings, carpets, and classrooms without warning. Touch it, breathe it, or get near it, and it could enter your body like an uninvited guest. Linked to everything from skin conditions to liver damage and cancer, PCBs were slowly banned through the late 70s and early 80s. But in their heyday, they were hailed as futuristic and advanced. We trusted the hum. We trusted the glow. And speaking of trust, television had a voice back then, and it was cool, smooth, and selling you cigarettes. Before you go, tell us in the comments which vanished. Freedom surprises you most. Tap like if this trip through aviation history brought back memories, and subscribe so you never miss the next journey into the past we left behind.